All right, thank you YouTube for tuning in. I'm here with my friend and colleague, David Deppeler. He's a physical therapist, I believe now located in Florida. I met him through qigong, through my teacher training program. And he now runs a company called Breathe Your Truth, which you can find on breatheyourtruth.com. And they look into the science, the modern science of the ancient practices of breathing. And so he's kind of quantified a lot of things about breathing and kind of can help dispel a lot of myths about it. And I'm also going to pick his brain a little bit about COVID-19, coronavirus, and how some of his discoveries about breathing tie into some theories about how we can keep ourselves healthy through this challenge. So welcome, David. And if it sounds like this is live going to YouTube, don't worry, it is not. This. We got time to cut out the nonsense. But sure. Thanks for joining. And I guess my first question, or maybe not question, but first thing I'd have you do is just kind of summarize your overall approach to breath, maybe what you see lacking in, I guess in particular, like the yoga world and where this, the kind of spaces where we're doing a lot of breath work and stuff, and just what differences you want to see happen in the world of breathing.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks a ton for striking up this conversation.
Yeah.
And one clarification, right now I would consider myself hanging out in Florida. I'm not quite sure that I'm from Florida yet. I still consider Portland, my home base, but who knows, in 6 months from now, it might be different. Yeah, it's a great question of, sort of what do I feel we're doing that might make us a little bit different? What do we like? What we don't like about what's happening in the breathing world? And I want to start it off by saying, as I have learned and been on this journey myself and have helped many people through it, what I realize is almost everything that's happening out there has got a place. And so I really entered into the scene with a bend and with a framework, with a structure, with tools that made me look at some of those outside things and, either wonder where they fit or actually even feel like they don't fit. And now as I'm, years and years down the road, I realize, and I'm seeing a construct that you can look at all these practices that are happening in yoga, in Wim Hof, Taoist practices. There, I think, really is an awesome place where these fit into a scheme. And over the years, that's sort of been what's emerging, is to appreciate and understand when is the right time to bring this stuff in. And if I had to answer in a short bit, what I think makes what we're doing different isn't so much the practices that we do, it's that we're developing a criteria of when you do them. And we're probably spending a little bit more time in the foundational phase than many of these practices do. In other words, getting people to be able to breathe well, sitting baseline. Turns out that's actually kind of ninja level breathing. Most of us, when we go into heavy activity, we actually breathe well. We ventilate just as we should. We do better, and that's why a lot of us like exercise and we like these more aggressive practices. But what we're finding really is kind of that ninja level is, can you actually sit still and breathe in a way that brings your chemistry into balance? And we use technology to help us out with that. I mean, I'd love to say we're smart enough to just know where people are exactly, when and where, but we cheat. And we use some nice technology that lets us actually see what's happening with carbon dioxide levels, which turns out it's a great metric to watch because it's what our body watches. Our breathing is actually driven by carbon dioxide levels, not so much oxygen levels.
I feel like it's a big myth. Probably 99% of people believe is that carbon dioxide is just a waste product. Your body, all it does with it is just get rid of it. It's like a poison gas or something.
Right.
But it seems like it's becoming, even outside of your stuff, it's becoming more popular. I'm reading a book right now called The Oxygen Advantage. It seems like something you've probably read. And it's going into that, just like how our body, can you explain how our body uses carbon dioxide, what it's actually for in the body?
Yeah. And I mean, first of all, say hats off to you for going after Oxygen Advantage. Patrick McCowan, the Irish guy who wrote that, has done an awesome job in that book.
I love how he got an Irish voice actor to do the audiobook. So you're still listening to it in an Irish accent, even though it's not him.
It feels a little more authentic, yeah.
Yeah, that's my
Yeah,
only Irish audiobook, so it's nice to listen to.
and he's a really good guy. I've done the certification program through Oxygen Advantage, and I'll give it a big thumbs up. It is one of those things that I think kind of fits in a criteria. So I have a little reservation about people entering into that world, but the concepts that he brings in this work are all right there. They're good. So yeah, to talk about how does carbon dioxide play a role in regulating our breathing, our body actually has more receptors to carbon dioxide than what it does to oxygen. So we do have some oxygen receptors that our body is listening to oxygen to determine if we should breathe more or breathe less. They're located primarily in our aorta and our carotid artery. But all over our body, and especially in our hindbrain, we've got chemical receptors that are actually listening to the level of CO2. And so these are really the big drivers, and they'll override that information that's coming from oxygen level in a heartbeat. And so why CO2 is so important is that it is actually determining, it's the biggest determining factor to the pH of our blood. And the pH of our blood, or the acid-base balance of our blood, is what determines hemoglobin's willingness to let go of oxygen. In other words, that little molecule in our blood that carries oxygen and delivers it everywhere, turns out is kind of fickle and really has a bit of an attitude, and it has to have exactly the right chemistry, or it hoards that oxygen and doesn't let it go. So you can put a pulse oximeter on someone's finger and saturation is fantastic. But what we don't know is that oxygen actually getting to the tissue that needs it? And what will determine if hemoglobin lets go of it or not is the pH level, which is largely determined by our breathing behavior or carbon dioxide levels.
So the carbon dioxide raises the pH to alkaline, yeah?
Correct, yeah. So, no, I'm sorry. When our carbon dioxide is low, we're actually in more of an alkaline state.
Oh, okay. So
when our carbon dioxide is high, we're in a more acidic state. Almost think of it as lactic acid, which is, a lot of that is carbon dioxide. It's an acid. People usually find that easy to remember. High levels of CO2 mean we're in more of an acid place. We actually want to have acid tolerance. And so the breathing dysfunction that's most prevalent out there is people are actually breathing more than what they need to. And what that means is they're blowing off CO2. So their CO2 levels are too low. And if that lasts for long enough, the chemical receptors in your hindbrain actually increase sensitivity to CO2. In other words, if those chemical receptors are used to CO2 being low, if there's any small bump up in CO2, they panic. And they'll actually tell your body to start breathing a whole lot more. So you create this breathing kind of pattern where any little bump up in CO2, like that happens with exercise or that happens with stress, you'll get an exaggerated response to start breathing more. What that actually does then is it makes hemoglobin bind oxygen even tighter, and ironically, your body has to work harder to get that oxygen. So
that's why when we start these practices where you're kind of restricting the breath, your body, it feels so uncomfortable. You feel like you're not getting enough air, but then you do them for a little while and so it just gets easier and easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Those chemical receptors, you can train them. So you can up-train, down-train them. You can make them more sensitive or less sensitive. Less sensitive is much closer to health. I mean, we want them
Have you come across anything that increases your body's output of CO2? Like I've been reading this work by a biochemist named Raymond Peat, who's kind of not contentious, but like everything in the nutrition world, everything's a big argument. But basically, he talks about using nutrition and supplements to get your mitochondria to switch to burning more glucose and less fat. Actually, right now everybody's trying to get everything to burn fat, but he's about getting it to burn glucose because the glucose will yield more CO2 and the CO2 will be good for your body. Whereas I think he says like the fat will turn into lactate and lactic acid and stuff instead. Have you come across anything about actually making your body just make more carbon dioxide? Does breathing techniques do that?
There's certainly breathing techniques to do it. Yeah. In terms of supplement, there probably are some things. I always look at it as, or I should say, I'm learning to look at it as anything you do as a supplement is going to come with a downside. I know it's a bit of a rash statement, but it just seems that over and over again. Like I was reading an article on inhaling nitric oxide. which I know is a whole nother can of worms. But essentially, it's finding some positive effect with it with COVID-19, but still nothing as good as actually doing the things that create endogenous or nitric oxide coming from your body. Same thing with CO2. Yeah, definitely. There are practices that you can be doing that bump your CO2 up in a nice way that equate to much better health. One of them, I mean, which you know in the qigong world, Taoists talk about a technique called embryonic breathing. And it's generally a meditation practice that starts out essentially recognizing where your breathing is right now. And then through a series of steps, you actually drop to a place that your breathing becomes more like an embryo. In other words, it isn't a mechanical breath. It's a breath that's happening just by your cells breathing. And what that practice does is it just coaches you into a nice stepwise way to get to minimal breathing, which when we're sitting in meditation or when we're sitting listening to someone or when we're even sitting at a computer, our oxygen demand is actually very small. And so our breathing, if we're skillful, should actually move to that easy place. It's just that unfortunately in the world we live in, where things are amped up most of the time, we stay breathing like we're walking down the street when we're sitting at a computer. So
I guess what my question was I know some of these breathing techniques, they get you to keep the carbon dioxide in your blood, like the carbon dioxide that your body's producing from metabolism stays in your blood because you're not just blowing it out with like this over breathing. But do you know of any of them that actually make the mitochondria, make the metabolism actually produce more carbon dioxide than it might normally, or switch to more carbon dioxide production?
Well, all you have to do to increase carbon dioxide production is move, is exercise.
Yeah.
And so frequently, let's say if we're working with someone trying to elevate their CO2 levels on a capno trainer where we're measuring them, if I can't talk them through the process, I know I can always just have them do 10 squats, 10 push-ups, and it'll bump their CO2 up. Okay, just like going for a run will bump your CO2 up. Your mitochondria, everything are pushing out a whole lot more CO2. And again, it's why a lot of times we like those activities. They may be hard while we do them, but we feel better after it because chemically we're in a better place. Does that answer your question? Is that what you're wondering? Like, what do you do?
Yeah, yes. Yeah, I'm trying to connect it to this stuff I've been reading, but it's kind of probably nobody else is reading this stuff, so it's probably not relevant to many people, but that is interesting. Okay, so one thing you said was, so even this minimal breathing stuff, this kind of lowering the over breathing, you're saying that even that isn't necessarily always the right tool for everybody, right? Like even that should be kind of used more surgically. Can you say like what kind of person that wouldn't be correct for? What kind of time that wouldn't be correct for?
Yeah, well, practices like the minimal breathing do work for most people. There are many ways to go at minimal breathing. In other words, I wish it was as easy to say, hey, just breathe a little bit less. When we're using the capno trainer with folks, which is the technology that lets us see this, we've got kind of a favor list of about 5 or 6 things that we'll try. And generally when people are starting this work, it's one of those things that works. Eventually they all work. But in the beginning, as people do this practice, and it's a very appropriate entry level, not that it's easy, but it is where we start with people. The things that I would say are the ones where we want to be much more methodical and bring them in when they're ready are things like the Taoist practice, the heart mirror, where you're using hyperventilation to kind of reach an altered state, or Wim Hof's method, which really has roots in Tibetan Tummo breathing. Those are all big hyperventilation activities that do give us kind of a jump start to our endocrine system and help with some other immune things, but they come at a negative expense to what we're doing with CO2. We're manipulating CO2, dropping it down incredibly low. And if someone's already got a pattern of doing that in their life, which most people do, you can just reinforce that pattern.
And what about, because at the end of those, I feel like what they do is you hyperventilate, you raise your oxygen, but it kind of just builds in your blood because you're blowing out all the CO2, so you're not actually absorbing the oxygen into the cells. But then at the end, that breath hold, the most powerful experience I ever had with that was when I was being coached by David Berdesi and the heart mirror stuff. And he was kind of coaching us to, when that urge, like at the end, you hyperventilate, at the end, you blow it all out.
Yeah.
Then you hold it out. And what he said was basically your body is eventually going to like scream at you. That urge is going to come up like, oh, take a breath, take a breath. And you're going to ignore that 4 times. So it's going to come up. You're going to ignore it. You're not going to take a breath. And eventually it'll learn to go away. But then it'll come back a few seconds later and you ignore that 4 times, which is like torture to do. Very hard to get yourself to do on your own without somebody coaching you through it. But that was when I noticed like every cell in my body lit on fire. I just poured sweat, like just something in my metabolism just turned on. And I feel like that is that carbon dioxide building back up because you're holding the breath out, but then your blood is full of that oxygen. So I guess it just shuttles this crazy amount of oxygen into your cells and just lights everything on fire. Do you think there's a more balanced way to do it? Like if you focus more on those breath holds or something like that?
Well, it is, I want to acknowledge that it is a really sweet practice, and I think it's got power. And the wisdom teachings, we've had ancients that have done this work and have, it has changed their life. And we also need to recognize they held that back. It was not done by the masses. And I don't think it's because they just, wanted all the power for themselves. I think there was some wisdom and they knew that many people, if they did this, it might actually produce a net negative. And when I first learned the practice, I was excited to bring it back into the clinic. And so I also exercised a little bit of judgment and I told myself, okay, I want to make sure that somebody can breathe well before we do this. In other words, they can sit, get their CO2 levels to the level where they should be. And then I took that as a green light to move into it, only to learn over time that if we brought this technique in too early, people actually started to decline in their baseline CO2. And even though they did breath holds and felt good with it, it wasn't enough to bring them back to their CO2 level that they were before they did it.
So that kind of like in the long term, it seemed to lower their overall CO2 scores.
Exactly. Yeah. I think you get
that's
a really
a good
nice
point about the masters who originally held these practices. I'm sure it wasn't the first thing their masters taught them, right? They probably learned to sit and to meditate and still their mind. Probably learned a bunch of other stuff first. That's an interesting point.
Yeah. So that's what we're playing with right now, is really trying to decide where is that point then that you can bring this in and we won't start getting an accumulative negative effect from doing it. And I don't know exactly where that is, but I feel like we're getting closer. The work that we do, we divide up into 3 phases, where the first one, getting that foundation, can you just sit and breathe well? Really the most profound part. The second one is, can you then take that and integrate that into daily activities? So can you use it during light activity? Can you use it during talking? Can you start to stay there during sleep? Things like that. That phase comes relatively easy. Phase 3 then is where we lean into this stuff pretty hard and we do things to improve physical performance or deepen meditation states. Everything kind of falls in those 2 categories. Turns out those are pretty close, but we can go at them differently. If you're going to move into that, using breath to deepen a meditation state, that is where we start to lean towards the Taoist heart mirror practice or the Tummo breathing. And to get back to, when is it that we decided we can go there? It probably is somewhere in the neighborhood of when people can engage in normal activities and regulate CO2 well. Then you can start to play in there. An example of how difficult that can be is watching people on a Kaplan trainer while they're talking. Most of us can sit back, listen, we get real skilled at bumping our CO2 up and being in a good place. But when we actually go to talking, we hyperventilate. And we would love for everyone to be able to not hyperventilate and then, go into some of these other practices.
What percentage of people that you've worked with do you think have too low CO2 just in their daily life, based on reading them through the Kaplan reader and stuff?
Yeah, it's a good question. And of course, the population that I'm working with is going to be biased towards it because of people who come to me to work on this. So they have some kind of gut sense that something might not be right. And with that population, we're looking at 80 to 90% of the people.
Right.
Now, most research says that overbreathing, or sometimes the term hyperventilation is used. There's some discrepancy as to if those 2 things are exactly the same name. We'll use them interchangeably here, but I'll acknowledge that I get the academic discussion around the 2 of them. but it puts it at somewhere to 10 to 12% of the population. Most people doing this kind of breath work realize it's somewhere much higher than 10 to 12%. If I had to come forward with my gut feeling on it, I'd say we're well over half the people walking around in Western cultures that are breathing more than they should at baseline and getting some negative health consequence because of that.
Do you think there is some kind of modern technological reason or some kind of cultural reason that we're experiencing? Like, it seems like we would have evolved to just naturally regulate our breath properly, and our ancestors who didn't do that would have just died or been out competed, right? Is there something modern going on that you think might be causing it?
Yeah, I'll lead with I don't really know, and then right behind that I'll say, to me, my intuition says it is likely that we push hard. It's everything, and may not necessarily show up as working hard, although I think for a lot of people that is exactly how it shows up. Is many people are working more hours per day than what probably is healthy for us. And when we're not, quote unquote, at work, our minds are still in this hypervigilant state. Yeah. I don't think it has to be our story. I mean, I think that it's an interesting blip in the evolution of humanity. I think there was, when life was actually more stressful in our hunter-gatherer stage, I don't think we actually had this problem. So there is something really fascinating about the modern era where really we have the technology and the ability to live simple and fulfilling lives, but we're just at this wonky stage right now where we choose to make it crazy. So we have the ability for it to be, much more spiritual centered, much more peaceful, but there still is something about our evolution where we can't quite let go. And so we drive ourselves crazy.
I think it's an opportunity thing. Like our hunter-gatherer ancestors, like, because you were nomads, you couldn't really accumulate wealth, right? Because you couldn't take it with you, right? So you could find all the shiny rocks you wanted. You're not taking them with you when you're following the caribou herd, right?
Yeah.
You could hunt all the animals you want. You could hunt extra animals, right? But you could only eat so many of them, and then there wouldn't be enough animals to produce the next generation. You'd starve the next year, right? So there was always kind of this cap on like how much work would actually yield something positive for you, right? So something in nature was kind of always like, well, you could keep working. You could work 12 hours a day every day, but you wouldn't really get anything for it, right? It might make your life worse. So there's kind of a natural impediment to overwork. And now it's kind of like, well, you can get all the stuff you want and you can collect it all in a single place, right? And there's all these things you can have because people have all been freed up to produce all kinds of different goods and services. And there's an infinite amount of wealth and variety of products and everything you can have. So yeah, I think it's got a reason to be, there's a reason we're pushers now, I think.
Yeah. And it's, to take that a little bit further, it isn't so much the physical things that we have, it's the stories we hold around it. That's really it. It shows up as, all these other things, whether they're obligations or they're material things. But ultimately we'll, hopefully land in that place where you don't necessarily have to renounce them. You'll, if you look at them differently, you'll want to accumulate differently. But it really is about the stories we hold around things that likely drives overbreathing or not.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you've talked about the capno capno thing. I don't know what you call it. Capno breather. Just called the capno.
Capno trainer.
It's some kind of capno trainer. Capno, right? Not capno.
Yeah, capno as in capnography, which is just the science of measuring carbon dioxide.
Okay. So this is something you just stick on your finger? Is it something ordinary people can buy?
We do it with a cannula. It's a little box. In 2 seconds I could have one here to show you. I could run and grab it. But essentially it's a small box that we plug into the computer, and it goes in, a cannula goes into the nose. So we're actually picking up CO2 that's breathed out through the nose. It doesn't measure volume, it's actually measuring partial pressure. So it's not like it has to collect all of it. It just needs a little sample, and it gives us the partial pressure of carbon dioxide during the breath out, which is the same as carbon dioxide in the arteries. So it gives us.
Can ordinary people buy this, or does this hook up to some like giant machine you'd only see in a clinic, or is this like an app on your phone, or?
Yeah, it's yes, ordinary people can buy it. It's not cheap. The units are about $4,000.
Oh my God.
Right now, yeah. And you can buy less expensive ones, less expensive being somewhere in the $2,000 range. So they're
Okay.
not accessible on the market yet to the general population.
Mm,
Now, what we do at Breathe Your Truth is we rent them out. And so generally when we're doing this work with people, people only need it for around a month. That gives us 4 sessions. It's just enough time for them to start to get what it is that a good breath actually is. And then once they've got that, we can let go of the technology, step away with it, and just use what's learned. I've got about half the people who decide to rent it for 2 months.
mhm.
And so for right now, that's the easier way to get access to it than, forking out the change to actually buy one. It wouldn't surprise me if in a couple of years, we're starting to see things hit the market that are much more affordable.
Nice. Well, that's a cool option you've
Big
created for
problem.
people. You just ship it to them, eh?
Yeah, just ship it in 2 to 3 days. They've got it at their doorstep. And then
Wow.
when I'm working with them, they just screen share.
Mhm.
And so it's super slick. I can be anywhere and help them with their breathing.
Nice. That is so cool.
Yeah.
So somebody watching, what if somebody here is an inventor or a tech investor? Yes, let's get on this. This would be a cool
Yeah, let's
product.
make a
I'd
capital
buy
train, not $4,000.
it. Yeah, like 400, 200.
Yeah.
Um, we mentioned sleep. So are people over breathing in their sleep? I've been trying experimenting with a little mouth taping recently,
Yeah,
which
what do you think of
freaked me out at first. I was like, "Am I
that? Yeah.
gonna die in my sleep? My nose
Turns
is
out you
plugged or
didn't.
something?" Turns out I didn't die. It also turned out you're not supposed to like just put a giant piece of duct tape like over your whole mouth. It's like you put like a postage stamp sized piece of tape on your lips, and it really holds. I was really surprised. I thought for sure my mouth, like it's not even strong tape. It's like a little tiny square of masking tape, and my mouth actually keeps it on the whole night, even with like my face fur kind of
Yep.
impeding some of the tape. And I was really surprised. But I do feel like I'm waking up with a little more energy, and my nose feels clearer in general. I have a little bit of like a bent bridge in my nose, so it does get kind of stuck sometimes. But I do feel like it's working. It's only been a
Beautiful.
week.
Beautiful. Yeah, all really good points. And it does vary some from person to person, but everybody makes the progression where eventually it takes just a small amount of tape to actually be a stimulus for your body to keep your mouth closed. It doesn't actually have to create the mechanical force, it just has to be a signal there, and then your body knows what to do with it.
Mm.
And that is the hope, is that if you can stay in mouth breathing during night, I'm sorry, stay in nose breathing during the night, your body gets access to a whole lot more nitric oxide. All right. Now, many other things happen that are fantastic with nose breathing, and that's that the air gets humidified, it gets filtered, it helps your diaphragm work better. That means your parasympathetic nervous system stays on board better. It also helps your digestion during sleep, helps venous return, all these great things by just using your diaphragm better. That happens with nose breathing. But one of the things that gets me excited enough to fall out of the chair is just what happens with nitric oxide during
Yeah.
nose breathing. And that is nitric oxide is this phenomenal compound that can be made endogenously in our body, primarily in our parasinus cavities, in our nasal passages, in our pharynx. And when we breathe that into our lungs, it's a vasodilator. It helps hemoglobin bind oxygen better. It essentially makes us much more efficient with a whole lot less effort. The wild thing about nitric oxide also is that it's an antihistamine, so it's going to help clear your nose. It's an antibacterial agent. It's an antifungal. It's an antiviral. All right.
Wow.
So in the age of COVID, it's all of a sudden become really relevant
Mm.
in terms of can it actually do 2 things? One, can it stop you from actually taking on the infection? And if you do have it, if you stay in more nose breathing, does it actually help you come out of it faster? And right now, the answer to both of those appears to be yes. Right?
Nice.
We know it from SARS in 2002, 2003. They started looking at people inhaling nitric oxide and found that they didn't get the respiratory distress nearly as much, and they came out of it faster. And so the big question on the table now is, if we can get people to be nose breathing, will it actually keep them from contracting the virus? And there's a really good chance it can.
Wow, that is really cool.
Yeah.
How exactly does your nose make the nitric oxide? Is there bacteria in there like putting it out, or what's going on with that?
Well, it goes after bacteria. I don't know. I don't know exactly how your nasal passage is produced. I just know that it is produced primarily in your nasal passages, in your pharynx,
Wow.
and actually in your blood vessels.
Whoa. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Nobel Prize that was awarded to the scientists who discovered it in 1996.
Hmm. Does nose breathing during sleep have any effect on the carbon dioxide or this other stuff we were talking about?
Indirectly, I would say. I mean, you get
Mm-hmm.
two really powerful things that happen when you stay in nose breathing. Like I mentioned, you get an improvement in nitric oxide and you get your diaphragm to function better. All of those will translate to your autonomic nervous system being happier. In other words, your sympathetic nervous system will start to quiet, parasympathetic nervous system will come up a bit more. Right? Those things will indirectly help you be happier with less breath. If your sympathetic nervous system's charged up while you're sleeping, you're going to be breathing more. And it's likely you're going to be breathing much more than what your oxygen demand actually is.
Yeah.
So yeah, indirectly, I would say that will help CO2 levels get to the place you want. You know, you think of it this way, carbon dioxide is a metric we watch. You know, nitric oxide levels could be a metric we watch. None of them are the actual thing we're going for. You know, what we're going for is people to feel better and, you know, live that life that is in much more homeostasis than what it is if these things aren't in play. So yes, carbon dioxide, great thing to watch. But we're taking it as a mirror, as an indirect metric to what we're really going for, which is just to help people live their lives that, you know, are what they're meant to live. With some ease, excitement, joy, love, compassion.
Yeah, but you won't have as much of if your brain's not pulling the oxygen out of your blood.
Yep.
Seems like
if it has
good thing to have going on, considering how oxygen hungry the brain is. So we just touched on how nose breathing could be helpful with coronavirus. Is there anything else you've discovered in your breath investigations related to coronavirus?
Yeah, that's, you know, it is the question on the table right now. And so, in fact, I'm working with a company, Therapeutic Associates, which is the company that I used to work for. And we've got a course coming up in September that's going to be part of the content is what is it we can be doing with the breath to be helping people either prevent getting it or those who have it to minimize it or those who have had a really beastly version of it to kind of fix what the damage that happens with COVID. And we've got a list of things that we're recommending. Number one, top of the list, we all know this: eat well, rest well. All right, that's huge for our immune system. And the better your immune system is, the less it's going to play out, or even less chance of you getting it. Next on the list is breathe light. In other words, make it a practice that you minimize that breath, appreciating what it does to CO2 levels. Right next to that, breathe through your nose. Most of us feel like we breathe through our nose and that we're not mouth breathers, but more and more evidence is coming out saying most of us breathe a whole lot more through our mouth than we ever give ourselves credit for. The two places it happens in are when we're exercising and when we're sleeping, right? And those are two crucial times to stay in nose breathing, okay? Breathing low in your body, what that does is gets your diaphragm to play in the game. Your diaphragm will go on vacation if it doesn't have to work. And you can just breathe in your upper chest. But when you breathe with your diaphragm down low, not only do we breathe with more ease, we stimulate parasympathetic nervous system, we improve digestion, we improve venous return back to the heart, we improve internal organ function, all these really great things. One more on there that we haven't talked about is humming. Right? If we're looking at breathing related practices right now, given the COVID situation we have, one of the more powerful things you could do preemptively and or if you have contracted it is to have a practice of humming. What humming does is it improves nitric oxide production by about 15 times from your normal baseline.
Oh, wow.
For 10 minutes, it's a big bump in nitric oxide. It's going to help your body fight any bacteria. It keeps anything that comes in through your nose or mouth from becoming a problem as it enters your airway. Okay, so humming, maintaining good spine.
Oh, hold on. What counts as humming? Like singing, chanting? Like, what are we talking about with humming? Just going with your mouth closed, or?
That'll work. Yeah,
But does it work if you sing and your mouth is open?
Yeah, so the jury is still out on what exactly are the best humming practices. There's a fair amount of research being done with the yogic humming practices, because that is a common practice where the humming is done with the mouth closed, breathing in through the nose, out through the nose. It is likely that's going to come out as being the best way to be humming. So you're not breathing in through your mouth, because what you actually want is once you've brought out more nitric oxide, you want to breathe right back in through your nose so you carry it down into your lungs. Most people leaning towards somewhere in the 10-minute range. There hasn't been enough research done on that for us to know where is that sweet spot, where we're getting enough and now, hitting the diminishing returns. But there's a lean right now to something like 10 minutes a day. Speech and language pathologists talk about humming as a way to improve vocal cord strength and diaphragm function. You got to think of it good for one system, it's good for others. How they teach it, which is a nice way, and it's how I start people, is you hum to a resonance that you can feel your back teeth kind of vibrate together. So try that once, where you let your back teeth be close and hum to a level that you feel them vibrate.
It's to vibrate more if it goes higher. It's interesting.
Yeah. So find that volume, that tone.
Yeah.
And what the researchers think why humming helps with nitric oxide production is it's just the oscillation of the parasinus passages. So when they vibrate, because of the air oscillating and also the mechanical vibration through your skull, that's what mobilizes the nitric oxide. And so you want to hum to a place, to a tone, to a volume that gives you that vibratory sense.
Interesting.
Usually what that means, if you're walking down the street and if someone is half a block away, they won't hear you. If they're closer than half a block, they'll hear you.
I have heard, people used to talk a lot about how chanting and humming and those kind of things stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. But then I'd also heard that basically that was just because of the fact that your exhale was so long, like just a longer exhale than inhale stimulates parasympathetic, and the opposite would stimulate sympathetic. For everybody watching who doesn't know what that is, the parasympathetic nervous system is like your relax, healing, rest and digest branch of your nervous system, and sympathetic is your fight or flight, kind of action oriented. But what do you think? Is something about the making a sound, does that stimulate the parasympathetic, or is it just a long exhale?
Yeah, no, I think it's much more than that. And even if it was just that, then, awesome. But no, I think we're seeing that it's more than just the slowing your exhale, because the research that's been done has actually shown you can have somebody breathe at the same volumetric measurement and also the same rate, but the vibration and the humming is what really bumps up the nitric oxide production. And again, you look at nitric oxide, that's one metric. If one metric moves, it's likely that a lot of other metrics move that we're not even watching.
Yeah.
And yeah, so we're probably getting better parasympathetic tone, we're getting better nitric oxide production, we're setting the stage for better CO2 levels. All those things all bump up. So yes,
I'm excited to see if anybody researches all of our magic sounds, like all our special chants and special sounds and everything, and do they make a difference, or is just going is that the best
yeah
thing?
Yeah, I mean, you kind of wonder
if different effects,
if the tone, if the practice of saying om, that probably is really close to that resonant frequency.
Yeah, like the way, because you're stimulating different areas of your mouth and throat and face depending how you're shaping your mouth for the sound, right?
Yeah.
The whole idea with the om is you're moving the sound from the back to the front, right? It's the om, right?
Yeah.
Interesting to see somebody dive into the research on that.
Yeah, and it is happening. The yoga world seems to be moving really nicely with the research that's come out on nitric oxide, probably because they're doing the most of the chanting and vocalizing with practices to see, is there one that's better than the other? But there's good evidence to say just that very simple, lips closed, vibrate to the place where you can feel it in your back teeth. For most of us mortals, that's a great place to be.
Yeah. So if I want to improve my breathing, I'm going to tape my mouth shut at night.
Yeah.
I'm going to practice some minimal breathing, which maybe we'll have you just coach us through one of those at the end here, maybe.
Sure.
I'm gonna chant or sing or something like
Hum.
that.
Yes.
Hum especially.
Yep. Keep your mouth shut. Yep.
Keep your mouth shut and hum 10 minutes a day. Exercise. We're gonna breathe through our nose when we're exercising. So how would you recommend somebody do that? So let's say I'm training in running, right? Actually, yeah. I just got my Zero trail shoes. Have you checked out the Zero shoes? You must be nerding out on that, right? The minimalist shoes, no heel. Yeah. I just got my trail running shoes.
No rise.
What's that?
No rise in the heel.
No rise, no padding. Yeah, it's just nothing. It's which actually felt really good. Like the muscles in my feet are sore today. I just went out running with them for the first time yesterday, and you could feel all these muscles I've never felt sore that are just super activated. So that is really cool. But so anyways, it's motivating me to get out and like work on my cardio a little, which I don't normally do a lot of. So basically, what would I do? When I go running, I'm just gonna run until I can't breathe just through my nose anymore, and then I'm gonna go to a walk and just keep breathing through the nose until I get it back, and then I start running again. Is that the idea?
Yeah, so you can look at it as you hit a fork in the road. So you've got two options, and they both will work if you do them. One of them is you then just go to mouth breathing and finish out at the intensity that you want. Track that over time and just see that with each time you do it, you can go a little further before you have to go to mouth breathing. That's the slow road to get there, but it does work. And for some people, let's say if you're running with a group, it is sort of what you need to do if you want to stay in the group.
Right.
Okay. But the fast track to get there is to not allow yourself to come into mouth breathing and to decrease the intensity. All right.
And this will get you there a whole exercise?
It does. And, it was probably 10 years ago that I started having people do this. And what I would say to them is, when you get to a heart rate of somewhere around 135 beats per minute, you probably need to shift to mouth breathing. And then I started having these elite runners come back saying, I'm running at 170 beats per minute and I can stay in mouth breathing. And now, flash forward 10 years, yes, stay in nose breathing. Thanks. Now, flash forward 10 years later, there's more and more science saying, no, actually, you can hit those intense levels and still stay in nose breathing, and your system just keeps getting more and more efficient. Where it seems to fall apart is if you're doing high intensity training, interval training. So it isn't that you're doing a run where you're building up to it, but if you're just hitting it hard right out of the gate, those are times where, right now we're saying, yes, you can drop into mouth breathing, but you recover in nose breathing. That's rare. If you're going to a spin class, or you're going out for a run or doing any of that, you stay in nose breathing for the whole thing. Most of the research shows within 3 weeks, you'll be exceeding where you were when you were integrating a mix of nose and mouth breathing. So it takes your body about 2 to 3 weeks to get to that level, or exceed that level of where you were before, but you do get there.
So do you think it actually improves people's overall endurance or athletic ability?
Absolutely. Really? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got...
Definitely feels like a hindrance in the beginning.
Yeah. So you give yourself that 2 to 3 weeks to, decrease performance. But I've had athlete after athlete come back being completely sold on it because they hit that place where now, they were running faster, running further, staying in nose breathing, lower heart rate, feeling a whole lot better, and they have a kick. So now when they have to turn the gas on at the end, they've got reserve in the tank. Neurologically, we know things are different when you breathe through your mouth versus your nose. For instance, breathing through your nose, our brain cycles more alpha waves. When we breathe through our mouth, we cycle more beta waves. Beta associated with stress response, alpha associated with parasympathetic tone. Just that simple bit of evidence says the longer you can stay in nose breathing, the more your body is kind of in control.
That's so cool.
And you do not have to sacrifice physical performance for it.
And it actually might increase it. What about for like team sports, like a hockey player or something, where you're generally your pace is always kind of just matching the intensity of people around you, right? Is that possible for those kind of sports too?
Yeah, I think it is, and it probably comes in the training aspect. So, hockey, basketball, tennis, good examples. That's like that big burst stuff that you don't actually, you're not warming into it. It's you're hitting it hard and then you're stepping back. So probably when you're doing that activity, you are going into mouth breathing, but as you train it, you come back and you recover in nose breathing. And when you're actually practicing any of those, you're actually staying in nose breathing. And
have you ever had a client and doing an intense sport like that who you eventually managed to train them so that nose breathing was better than mouth breathing during their sport?
Runners, cyclists have been the most
endurance seems to.
Yeah. Swimmers are an interesting one because nobody should be nose breathing when they're swimming.
Right.
No good is going to come of that.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And yet swimmers aren't really where we see a lot of the dysfunctional breathing. Cyclists and runners are where we see most of it. And I think it's just
because swimmers have to hold their breath for part of their activity, right? So they're building that carbon dioxide either way.
Yeah, they're always working to regulate their breathing.
Interesting.
Yeah, so you end up, it's definitely a negative to breathe through your mouth, but you're probably coming out with a net gain because you're regulating and actually staying in a place of hypoxia a fair amount, which, we haven't talked about, but that's Patrick McCowan's work, is looking to see, can you lean into hypoxia as a way to hit the reset on those chemical receptors in your central nervous system? And turns out you can.
Oh, I had another. Oh, yeah. One thing I'm curious about, I'm not sure if there's been any research on alternate nostril breathing. So we know breathing through the nose better than the mouth. Is there any reason to believe that breathing through one nostril at a time, like in Nadi Shodhana, that would have any particular, like so the way the yogis describe it, right, and even the Taoists is, it's good for the energy channels, right? Breathe in one nose, clears the energy channel on the left of your spine, breathe through the other, clears the energy channel on the right of your spine. Okay, I mean, that's kind of, you'd never be able to prove or disprove that with any like machines or anything, right? But yeah, maybe there's something to it. But is there any like physiological evidence that that's helpful for something?
Yeah, I'm no expert on that one, but I have heard at least some basic level research showing that we get increased parasympathetic nervous system when people can do the alternate nostril breathing. Sometimes people are backed up enough and have got enough sinusitis that they can't, and then it will escalate the sympathetic response. So I say that just if people are struggling to breathe, we don't want to coach them into that. But if you're breathing freely and do that practice, it does seem to give a bit of a bump in parasympathetic nervous system activity, better than just doing nose breathing. It stands to reason if you actually concentrate the nitric oxide that you're pulling in one nasal passage, it may give you even more opening in that. And if you alternate back and forth, you just kind of get a little bit more on one side, a little more on the other. That may change the energy through the system. I'm not sure. I have learned over time to kind of trust those ancient practices that continue to live. The lesson that we seem to be getting is eventually science says, thumbs up to it. And I suspect that may be one of them that does too. We may not have really good solid science to support it now, but it wouldn't surprise me if things emerge to say, we're actually getting this metric to bump up with it.
Seems like it happens for a lot of stuff. I keep thinking of that about like Tai Chi and stuff. It's like, why isn't there any Tai Chi in the UFC? Like if it really worked, it's like, well, if it really didn't work at any point, like everybody who learned Tai Chi 600 years ago would have got killed by everybody who knew karate, and Tai Chi would have died out. So like all these things got passed down for a reason,
Yeah, if they're still there may be a good reason.
Function.
Yeah. I mean, Tai Chi, actually, there's a lot of evidence to show that it improves balance and proprioception in seniors.
For sure, but I mean, more as a martial art, which is what it was originally developed for. I think a lot of the martial technique got kind of lost when the communists were kind of stripping everything down, and that's probably why you don't see a lot of it in the mixed martial arts and stuff like that. Anyway, it seems like a good time to maybe you could coach us through a couple of breathing exercises. I guess probably oriented around this minimal breathing. Would be cool to get a feel for that. And maybe I'll cut it and also make it like a little separate video that people could use just outside of this.
Yeah, sure. And then we can also direct them to the website because anyone can get access to all of phase one activities. And that's a
Nice.
lot of what phase one activities are. So there's many of them on the website they can download and play with.
Nice.
Yeah, let's do a real popular one called feather breathing. And Buteyko have brought this in. I'm seeing some Ayurvedic practitioners bring this in under the term feather breathing as well. And so it's a nice entry point. I want to say that it works for a lot of people, but not everybody. So if in doing this practice you feel like it's not a comfortable practice, don't worry, you're not alone in that. And that there's probably about 25 to 30% of the people who this one still is not a fit for. If we look at the practices that we do with everyone out of the gate, this is the one that works for most people. So we start with it, but it's not everybody.
Nice.
All right. So let's start. Index finger just comes to your upper lip. And think of it as the part that you kiss with, not this part up here below your nose, but right on your upper lip. And then first just feel the breath on your finger, and you'll likely feel both movement and temperature. And then once you've got that, you're going to allow the breath to become a little more subtle. And then subtle in a way that you don't feel any movement on your finger. So you may feel some heat. We'll say the heat's okay, but see if you can make your breath a little more subtle so that there's no movement of air on your finger. And that generally means a little smaller breath in and a little slower breath out. And the trick is to do it in a way that feels sweet. And so you can overachieve with this activity and essentially make too big of a change, and you'll start to feel that it's not going to feel good. But right before that was a way to do it that actually feels really nice. So you're looking for that way to make the breath subtle that actually feels surprisingly good. And most people, after a couple of minutes of doing this, they'll start to get a feeling like they want to take a big breath. So what we say is do that. Take that big breath and then come back to it. If you don't feel like you need that big breath, keep going. But if you want that breath, do it and then return. And then you can take your finger away, but continue that practice. So let your hands just rest in your lap. But imagine you've got the finger resting on your upper lip, and just continue that practice of allowing the breath to be surprisingly subtle and sweet. So that's one starting point.
Right. Feels so good.
Yeah.
Love
And
the
it
way
will,
you described that. Feeling for the heat's okay, but the movement's not. That made a lot more sense to me.
yeah, because inevitably people will tend to overachieve on it. You know, it's what we do. It's what gets us into trouble in the first place. So, I mean, that's the
Yeah.
pattern that we're all ingrained in is, more is better. If I try harder, things are better. We know in Tai Chi and Qigong that that's not the case, but it doesn't, learning it in that practice doesn't always translate to every practice.
Nice. Actually, I was meaning to ask you, in Qigong, when we're doing like our moving practice, you're a Qigong teacher too, so you probably got this all thought out pretty well. What are your recommendations for how people should breathe when we're doing these practices where the whole idea is to link the movement and the breath, right? How subtle do you think the breath should be? I'm often using Ujjayi breathing, right? The slight throat
Yeah.
constriction, and I find that just helps me get that breath like a little more subtle and slow, and that seems to feel really good for me. But what's your
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah. And I think the Ujjayi breath gives us, it gets close to humming. So it actually gives a bit of a nitric oxide bump as well. And so it is a nice practice to integrate into this. And it is a great question because my guess is a lot of us, as we enter into Qigong, we actually are over breathing, especially as, focus is on movements that increase the breath. Because we're pairing it with movement, because we're conscious of it, and hopefully you do the quiet meditation at the end, all those things for most of us likely translate to a gain. Okay. But if you knew the story of CO2 and the relevance of breathing less, all it takes is knocking off about 10% of the volume, but still pairing it with movement and getting it to be in the right place. If you could think of just bumping back 10% of the volume, and at times having a mild air hunger that is, surprisingly okay. We know when we actually have people do the work with the capno trainer, going for that 10% drop, they move CO2 into really nice levels. Okay. Without the capno trainer on, I think it's an interesting practice, but I hesitate a little bit with it because we don't want to coach people into too much baggage around the breath with this practice. And that can happen easily. We can, as we especially look into the science more and start bringing technology into this, it's really easy to start to run off the rails where people actually feel like they have an antagonistic relationship with their breath, where it no longer is their friend, it's something they have to work on. And so in one end, I'll say, yeah, if we could have people minimize their breath during qigong, that would be great. And another part of me is like, I don't know, maybe we just let it be, because we're getting so many other gains with the pairing, with the movement, and that is probably enough of a net gain. Now, I think awesome if you can do qigong and also do some practices that get you really good with, let's say the embryonic breathing part or the feather breathing, or that becomes part of your meditation. And maybe that's the better answer to your question: is let the breathing go when you're moving, just get the location of it how you want, but then when you come to the meditation part, then that becomes your time to really appreciate that less breathing gets you to a profound or a concentrated, focused place.
Nice. Cool. Well, I so appreciate your time. This was a super interesting conversation. Again, people can find more of your work if people are curious at breatheyourtruth.com. Remember, that's breathe your truth, not breath your truth. So throw an E.
Throw that E in there.
At the end of that breath, breatheyourtruth.com. And you're saying you got some free stuff there, like level 1, you got some free content?
Yeah, so all you have to do is register on the site with your name and email address, and you'll get access to all of phase 1 activities. Again, nice. 3 phases we work on. First one's foundational, second one is daily activities, and then that third one is improving performance and kind of depth of meditation. But I'll tell you it's good stuff in phase 1. It really is the biggest part. So yes, we've got that all on the website for you to grab.
Cool. Well, I'll be signing up for phase 1 for sure.
Have some fun.
Sounds awesome. Cool. Thanks so much, David.
Thank you, Nick. Great to see you as always.
Yeah.
Look forward to the next time.
Yeah.